Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going beyond those catchy tunes and diving into the underbelly of the music industry. Get ready to explore those shadowy deals, the controversial contracts that have shaped the careers of some of your favorite musicians.
It's a world where creativity clashes with commerce, right? And the pursuit of fame often comes at a steep price. We're going to be pulling back the curtain on both historical practices and modern-day trends, revealing how the music industry can be as cutthroat as it is glamorous.
We've got a mountain of fascinating material to sift through, legendary tales, legal battles, and even some modern-day examples that might make you question everything you thought you knew about the music business.
By the end of this deep dive, you'll have a whole new perspective on the music you listen to. We'll unpack that intricate web of contracts, royalties, and power dynamics that often dictate an artist's success or lack thereof.
Let's kick things off with a story that might surprise you. We're talking about the Beatles, arguably the biggest band in the world who, ironically, lost control of their own music publishing rights.
It's a cautionary tale that highlights the importance of understanding the fine print. Back in the 1960s, the Beatles signed away a significant portion of their future earnings when they made a deal with a company called Northern Songs. At the time, it probably seemed like a good decision, but it ultimately led to them losing ownership of some of their most iconic hits.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Those publishing rights eventually ended up in the hands of none other than Michael Jackson. Can you imagine having to pay someone else to use your own music? That's exactly what Paul McCartney faced.
This situation underscores how crucial it is for young artists, especially those thrust into the spotlight, to have a solid understanding of the legal and financial implications of the contracts they sign. It's a lesson that many musicians have learned the hard way.
It's a reminder that fame and fortune don't always go hand in hand with control and ownership, especially in an industry as complex as music.
Speaking of control, or rather the lack thereof, we can't talk about the music industry's dark side without delving into the history of Motown Records. It was a groundbreaking label that produced some of the most iconic music of the 60s and 70s. But it also had a controversial system that often exploited the very artists who made it a success.
Motown was like a hit factory, churning out chart-topping singles and launching the careers of legendary groups like the Temptations and Martha and the Vandellas. But behind the scenes, the financial reality for these artists was far less glamorous.
Motown's system, while efficient, was designed to maximize the label's profits, often at the expense of the musicians. The royalty rates paid to artists were shockingly low, often amounting to a mere $2 per song.
It's hard to believe that a song that could sell millions of copies would only earn the artist a couple of dollars. That's a stark contrast to the huge profits Motown was generating.
The system has been compared to sharecropping, where laborers work the land but receive a tiny fraction of the profits. One artist even described themselves as sharecroppers in sequins, highlighting the vast disparity between the label's wealth and the artist's meager earnings.
It's a powerful image that captures the exploitative nature of the system. Motown's success was built on the backs of talented musicians who were systematically denied their fair share of the profits. And unfortunately, this type of exploitation wasn't limited to the past. It's evolved in the digital age and taken on new forms.
You're absolutely right. In today's music industry, we see the legacy of Motown's practices reflected in what are known as 360 deals. These contracts have become increasingly common, and they represent a new level of control exerted by record labels over their artists.
These 360 deals are often presented as a way for labels to invest more heavily in an artist's career, but they come with strings attached. Instead of just taking a cut of record sales, labels now want a piece of everything: touring revenue, merchandise sales, even endorsements.
It's essentially a way for labels to control all aspects of an artist's income streams. While it can be beneficial for some artists who need that comprehensive support, it can also be incredibly restrictive and leave artists feeling trapped.
A high-profile example of the potential downsides of 360 deals is the case of Kesha. Her legal battle with producer Dr. Luke revealed just how these contracts can be used to control and potentially exploit artists. She was essentially locked into a contract that made it impossible for her to record new music without working with her alleged abuser.
It's a sobering example of how these all-encompassing contracts can create incredibly vulnerable situations for artists. The music industry is a business, and as with any business, profits often take priority. But when the well-being of the artists is compromised, it raises serious ethical concerns.
It's a reminder that the music we enjoy comes at a cost, and that cost is often borne by the artists themselves. But thankfully, not all artists have been willing to accept this status quo. Throughout history, there have been musicians who have fought back against exploitative practices and demanded fair treatment.
Absolutely. Prince was a fierce advocate for artists' rights and a vocal critic of the industry's power dynamics. He famously wrote the word slave on his face to protest his contract with Warner Bros. It was a bold statement that challenged the traditional power structure and brought attention to the struggles faced by many musicians.
And more recently, Taylor Swift has taken a stand by re-recording her old albums. She lost ownership of her master recordings due to a previous deal, but she's reclaiming her work in a strategic and impactful way.
Her decision to re-record her music has been incredibly successful, both commercially and symbolically. It demonstrates the power artists have when they leverage their influence and control over their creative output.
It's inspiring to see artists like Prince and Taylor Swift using their platforms to fight for their rights and reshape the industry. But it's also important to acknowledge that not every artist has that level of power and influence.
You're right, many artists, especially those starting out, face immense financial pressure and often lack the resources to challenge the industry's established practices. Kanye West's public declaration of his massive debt, for example, served as a stark reminder that even successful artists can struggle under the weight of unfavorable deals and financial mismanagement.
It's a complex landscape, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the stories of exploitation and power imbalances. But there is a glimmer of hope on the horizon.
The rise of independent platforms like Bandcamp and Patreon is empowering artists to connect directly with their fans and build sustainable careers outside of the traditional label system. These platforms offer artists more control over their music, their pricing, and their relationship with their audience.
It's exciting to see artists carving out their own paths and finding new ways to succeed without having to compromise their creative vision or their financial well-being.
It's a sign that the music industry is evolving. While the old systems of power and control are still in place, artists are finding ways to circumvent them and build more equitable and sustainable models for the future. But it's important to remember that not every deal is what it seems, and there are still many pitfalls to navigate in the music business.
It's like venturing into uncharted territory, where the allure of success can sometimes blind artists to the potential risks. We'll be back after a short break to explore some of those cautionary tales, including stories that blur the line between ambition and exploitation.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the music industry's underbelly.
We're picking up where we left off, exploring those cautionary tales, that fine line between ambition and exploitation.
Before the break, we touched on artists taking control through platforms like Bandcamp and Patreon.
Right, those platforms offer a way to bypass the traditional label system. But what about the even bigger behemoth in the room? Streaming services.
Ah, yes, the double-edged sword of streaming. On one hand, they've democratized access to music for listeners.
I know, I can't live without my playlists. But it feels like there's got to be a downside for artists.
There is, and it all comes down to those shockingly low royalty rates. Take Spotify, for example, a streaming giant that pays artists roughly $0.003 per stream.
Wait, you're telling me that an artist needs hundreds of streams just to earn a single dollar? How can anyone make a living from that?
It's a real struggle, especially for emerging artists who don't have a huge established fan base. To put it in perspective, imagine needing over 1,600 streams just to earn the equivalent of a $5 sandwich.
That's mind-boggling. It feels like the math just doesn't add up, especially when you consider the billions of dollars these streaming platforms are making.
It's a complex issue that has sparked a lot of debate and calls for reform within the industry. The current model, while convenient for listeners, isn't sustainable for many musicians, especially those who rely on music as their primary source of income.
So how did we get here? Was it always this bad for artists? Didn't they make more money from album sales in the past?
The music industry has always been a tough business, but the digital revolution and the rise of streaming have fundamentally changed the economics of music. In the days of physical albums and CDs, artists earned a larger percentage of the revenue from each sale.
Okay, so when people bought CDs, artists got a bigger slice of the pie.
Exactly. But with streaming, the revenue is spread much thinner, across millions of tracks and billions of streams. This means that even artists with millions of plays might struggle to earn a decent income.
It's a classic case of disruption, where new technology creates both opportunities and challenges. Streaming has made music more accessible than ever, but it's also created a new set of problems for the people creating that music.
And it's not just about the money. Streaming platforms also wield a tremendous amount of control over what music gets heard. They use algorithms to curate playlists and recommendations, which means that even talented artists can get lost in the shuffle if they don't play the algorithm game.
So it's not enough to just make great music. You also have to figure out how to get noticed by these all-powerful algorithms.
That's the reality for many artists in the streaming era. And while these algorithms can be useful for discovery, there's a concern that they could stifle creativity and lead to a homogenization of music. If artists are constantly trying to optimize their music for algorithms, it could result in a less diverse and less interesting musical landscape.
It's almost like a creative paradox. The technology that was supposed to democratize music might actually be narrowing the range of what we hear.
It's a valid concern that the industry is grappling with. The pursuit of streams and algorithmic favor could incentivize artists to create music that fits into existing trends, rather than pushing boundaries and experimenting with new sounds.
So where do we go from here? Is there any hope for a more equitable system that fairly compensates artists for their work in this streaming-dominated world?
There are ongoing efforts to reform the streaming model and ensure that artists receive a larger share of the revenue. Some platforms are experimenting with different payment structures, such as user-centric models where your subscription fee goes directly to the artists you listen to.
That sounds promising. But in the meantime, what can listeners do to support the artists they love in this complex landscape?
There are several ways to make a difference. First, be mindful of where your money goes. If you're a frequent streamer, consider subscribing to a service that pays artists a higher rate. Or explore alternative platforms like Bandcamp, where artists receive a larger portion of the sales revenue.
Right. Those platforms allow fans to directly support artists and ensure that more of their money goes directly to the creators.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of simply sharing music you love with your friends and networks. Word-of-mouth promotion is still incredibly valuable for artists, especially those who are trying to break through the noise.
So spread the love, support independent artists, and be an advocate for a more equitable music ecosystem. Every little bit helps.
Speaking of those who help artists navigate this complex world, let's shift our focus to the role of artist managers.
Okay. Managers. They're the ones behind the scenes, guiding artists' careers and making those huge decisions. I'm curious, what's the dynamic like between an artist and their manager?
Ideally, the relationship is one of trust, collaboration, and shared goals. A good manager acts as an advocate for the artist, handling negotiations, bookings, publicity, all the logistical aspects of a music career.
That sounds like a dream, to have someone handling all those details so you can focus on the creative side, but I'm guessing it doesn't always work out that way.
Unfortunately, no. While many managers are ethical and dedicated to their clients' best interests, there have been cases where managers have taken advantage of the trust placed in them.
We're talking about those dark side managers who prioritize their own gain over the artist's well-being.
Precisely. Throughout music history, there have been several high-profile cases of managers who've been accused of, well, everything, from mismanaging funds to manipulating artists into signing unfavorable contracts.
So even with a manager, artists still need to be cautious and protect their interests.
Absolutely. It's crucial for artists to have a clear understanding of their contracts, to seek legal advice when needed, and to be aware of the potential pitfalls of the industry.
It seems like the music industry is full of these ethical gray areas, where the line between ambition and exploitation can get blurred.
It's a business driven by both creativity and commerce, and when those forces collide, it can create a breeding ground for questionable behavior.
Let's delve into some specific examples. I've heard whispers about Alan Klein, a manager who handled legendary bands like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. What was his story?
Klein was a controversial figure, known for his aggressive negotiating tactics and his reputation for putting profits ahead of people. He was accused of mismanaging funds, taking excessive commissions, and even manipulating artists into signing contracts that benefited him more than his clients.
It's a reminder that even iconic bands aren't immune to the dark side of the industry. And speaking of iconic bands, what about Led Zeppelin? And their equally infamous manager, Peter Grant. He had a reputation for being quite intimidating.
Grant was a force to be reckoned with, fiercely protective of Led Zeppelin and known for using strong-arm tactics to get them the best deals. He was a master negotiator, but his methods were often questionable, blurring the lines between tough bargaining and outright bullying.
So he was a manager who got results, but perhaps not always through ethical means.
That's one way to put it. His approach was effective in securing Led Zeppelin's success, but it also contributed to a culture of excess and intimidation within the industry.
It raises a difficult question. What's the line between being a strong advocate for your client and resorting to exploitative or unethical behavior? Is it okay to bend the rules if it means achieving success?
Those are questions that continue to be debated within the music industry. There's no easy answer, as it often comes down to individual ethics and the specific circumstances of each situation.
It seems like there's a constant tension between the creative spirit of music and the ruthless nature of the business.
That's a great way to put it. The music industry is a place where passion and profit constantly collide, creating a complex and often unpredictable landscape.
It's been an eye-opening journey so far, and I'm sure our listeners are starting to see the music industry in a whole new light.
We've explored the historical context, the evolution of exploitative practices, and the challenges faced by artists in the digital age. But we're not done yet. There's still more to uncover, including some intriguing stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the music business. Stay tuned, we'll be back.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
We're wrapping up our exploration of the music industry's underbelly.
And we've saved some of the juiciest stories for last.
Ooh, I love a good mystery. What are we diving into now?
Let's talk about the hidden hand of organized crime in the music business.
Organized crime. Like mobsters and shady backroom deals, that sounds straight out of a movie.
Well, the reality is that organized crime has had a long and often shadowy influence on the music industry, dating back to the early days of jazz and swing.
So we're talking about a time when gangsters ran nightclubs and controlled the flow of money and talent. Exactly. In the mid-20th century, organized crime figures often had ownership stakes in clubs, record labels, even radio stations. They used their influence to promote certain artists, control distribution networks, and sometimes even intimidate rivals.
It sounds like a dangerous time to be in the music business. Were any famous artists connected to these mobsters?
There have been numerous rumors and allegations over the years, linking legendary figures like Frank Sinatra and Billie Holiday to organized crime figures. While the extent of their involvement is often debated, it's clear that organized crime had a significant presence in the industry during that era.
It's fascinating to think about how those connections might have shaped the careers of some of these iconic artists. Did they benefit from those relationships, or were they ultimately exploited?
It's a complex question with no easy answers. In some cases, mob-backed labels provided artists with opportunities and resources they might not have otherwise had. But there was always a price to pay for that support, often in the form of compromised creative control or a share of the profits.
It seems like a Faustian bargain, trading a piece of your soul for a chance at success.
That's a fitting analogy. The allure of fame and fortune could be intoxicating, especially in a time when social mobility was limited. But getting involved with organized crime always carried significant risks.
So how did the music industry break free from the grip of organized crime? Did things eventually clean up?
The influence of organized crime gradually declined as law enforcement cracked down on illegal activities, and the industry itself became more corporatized. But some argue that their influence never fully disappeared, simply evolving and taking on new forms.
You're suggesting that there might still be shady dealings and hidden power structures at play within the industry today.
It's certainly possible. While the overt presence of traditional mobsters might have diminished, there are always those who seek to exploit the system for personal gain. The music industry, with its large sums of money and global reach, remains an attractive target for those with less than scrupulous intentions.
It's a sobering thought that despite all the progress we've made, the dark side of the music industry might not be entirely in the past.
That's why it's so important for artists, fans, and everyone involved in the industry to be aware of the potential pitfalls and to advocate for a more transparent and ethical system.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We've explored everything from exploitative contracts and shady managers to the hidden influence of organized crime. It's clear that the music industry is far more complex and nuanced than it appears on the surface.
And that's precisely the point of these deep dives. We want to encourage you to think critically about the music you consume, to understand the forces at play behind the scenes, and to appreciate the artistry and struggles of the musicians who create the soundtrack to our lives.
So the next time you hear your favorite song, take a moment to consider the journey it took to reach your ears. The creative spark, the business deals, the triumphs, and the heartbreaks. Remember that music is a powerful force, but it's also a business. And like any business, it has its share of shadows.
The music industry is a microcosm of society itself, reflecting both our aspirations and our flaws. By understanding its history, its complexities, and its ethical challenges, we can become more informed consumers, more supportive fans, and ultimately contribute to a more equitable and sustainable music ecosystem.
Stay curious, keep exploring, and never stop listening for the stories behind the music.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the music industry's underbelly.
Until next time, keep those tunes spinning and keep those minds engaged.